Texas, summer, 1945. The air outside Camp Livingston shimmered like glass, a curtain of heat that made even the guard towers seem to waver. War in the Pacific still burned on distant islands, but here, deep in the scrubland of East Texas, the fighting had turned into something quieter. The sound of stretchers, the clatter of tin trays, the slow work of healing. Inside the camp infirmary, Sergeant David Monroe lay on a cot, his right leg bandaged from knee to ankle. The infection had come fast. A routine scrape turned feverish overnight. He'd been too proud to tell anyone until he could barely stand, and now the smell of antiseptic filled the air around him like judgment. A nurse dabbed his forehead. "You're lucky, Sarge," she said. "Doctor's on duty this morning." Monroe squinted. "Yeah? Which one?" She hesitated, and in that pause he understood. Not the Jap?" The nurse didn't answer. She just straightened the bedsheet and stepped aside as a small man in a worn khaki uniform entered the tent. His rank patch had been cut off. His hands were scrubbed clean to the wrists. He was perhaps 30, maybe a little younger, with the posture of someone who'd once been saluted and no longer expected it. "Good morning," he said softly, his English precise. "I am Dr. Kenji Sato." Monroe stiffened. "You're the prisoner." Sato inclined his head. "I am the physician assigned to assist here. The infection must be treated at once." Monroe turned toward the tent flap. "Get me an American doctor." "There are none now," the nurse murmured. "The captain's at the field clinic in Houston. He won't be back until nightfall." Sato set down a tray of instruments, steel gleaming under the lantern light, and pulled a mask over his mouth. "Please, Sergeant, I will help you." He spoke without pride or fear, as though mercy were a duty neither side could claim ownership of. Monroe's breath caught as Sato lifted the bandage. The wound was angry red, streaked with purple veins climbing his calf. "Damn," he whispered. The fever had spread faster than he'd thought. Sato worked quickly, irrigating the wound with carbolic solution. His movements were calm, rhythmic. Every tool was placed exactly where it belonged. The nurse handed him gauze, and Monroe felt the cold burn of antiseptic bite through the pain. "You were Army Medical Corps?" the nurse asked quietly. Sato nodded. "Before the war, Tokyo University Hospital. I was very proud then." Monroe gritted his teeth. "You ever patch up Americans before?" Sato's eyes lifted for a moment. Unreadable. "I have only one kind of patient now." The silence that followed was heavy but clean, like the air after lightning. Outside, a truck rumbled past, the laughter of other guards drifting faintly through the canvas. They didn't know that inside. The infirmary, one of their own, lay in the hands of a man they'd been taught to hate. When Sato finished, he stepped back. "It will heal if you rest. No walking for 3 days." Monroe wanted to argue, to find a word sharp enough to reassert the line between captor and captive, but all he managed was a nod. "All right, Doc." The nurse smiled faintly. It was the first time she'd heard anyone in the camp call a prisoner Doc. By evening, word had spread. A Japanese POW had treated an American sergeant and saved his leg. Some guards laughed it off. "Guess the war's really over if we're letting them play doctor." Others muttered darker things, but for the men in the infirmary, it was hard to ignore what they'd seen. Precision, humility, and something almost sacred in the way Sato moved between beds. Captain Harold Pierce returned from Houston that night, dust on his boots and telegrams in his pocket. He found Sato cleaning instruments in silence. "You touched one of my men," Pierce said. Sato straightened. "Yes, sir. His infection was severe." "Who gave you permission?" The nurse asked for aid. "I followed her instruction." Pierce studied him for a long time. "You realize if the sergeant dies, that's on your record. And if he lives," he paused, "that's on mine." Sato said nothing. He simply bowed, as if accepting both outcomes. When Monroe's fever broke 2 days later, Pierce visited the ward again. The sergeant sat up, pale but grinning, the color back in his face. "Sir," he said, "you ought to thank that Jap doctor of yours." Pierce blinked. "You mean Sato?" "Yeah, saved me from losing the whole damn leg." Pierce turned slowly toward the infirmary doorway, where Sato was folding towels. The Japanese doctor met his gaze but did not speak. It was the American who broke the silence first. "Keep him assigned here," Pierce said quietly to the nurse. Under supervision. Over the next weeks, the infirmary began to change. Sato arrived at dawn, silent as the heat itself. He kept records in neat Japanese columns that the American medics learned to read with surprising speed. He taught them sterilization methods that hadn't yet appeared in the Army manuals. Boiling. Instruments twice, filtering water through charcoal before using it on wounds. When questioned, he explained everything with the patience of a teacher rather than a captive. One morning, Monroe hobbled in on crutches. "Heard you're still fixing people up," he said. Sato looked up from a stretcher. "It is my purpose." Monroe leaned against the wall. "You know, Doc, half these fellas were ready to ship you home last week. Now they're fighting to keep you here." Sato smiled faintly. "Then I must continue working until they decide again." The camp had begun to soften in strange ways. Where once there were only orders and inspections, there were now conversations. Brief, careful exchanges that slipped through the wire like wind. Sato mended not only bodies but the brittle rhythm of the place. He shared small bits of knowledge: how to identify fever early by the color of the eyes, how to treat burns with aloe from the cactus plants growing beyond the fence. One evening, as the sun fell low over the pine trees, Monroe brought him a book from the camp library, Gray's Anatomy, its cover worn thin. "Thought you might like this," he said. Sato took it with both hands. "This book," he murmured, "was forbidden in my training. American text." "Well," Monroe said, "guess you're in the right place to catch up." For a moment, both men laughed. The sound foreign but familiar, like music learned twice. That night, a storm broke over Camp Livingston. Lightning struck the power line behind the infirmary, plunging the tents into darkness. The nurses lit lanterns, and through the flickering light came the cry of another wounded man. Private Allen, who'd been repairing fences when the storm hit. A splinter of wood had driven deep into his abdomen. Pierce and Monroe rushed in, but Sato was already kneeling beside the cot, fingers steady despite the thunder. "We must remove it now," he said. "No delay." Pierce frowned. "You think you can operate in this light?" Sato nodded once. "If we wait, he dies." The lanterns swayed as the wind pushed through the seams of the tent. Instruments gleamed in their trays, and the rain hammered like artillery on the roof. For the next 40 minutes, the camp held its breath. When it was over, Allen lay still but breathing. Sato's hands trembled only after he'd finished sewing the last stitch. Monroe wiped his forehead. "You ever get scared, Doc?" Sato looked down at his gloves. "Every time. That is why I must not stop." Pierce said nothing. He just stared at the man before him, the enemy soldier who had saved 2 Americans in a single week, and realized that somewhere between duty and mercy, the lines had blurred beyond recognition. In the days that followed, the storm damage was repaired, but the camp itself seemed different. Guards waved instead of glaring. Nurses asked Sato for advice on treatment. Even the prisoners under his watch began to mimic his careful posture, the quiet discipline that made every gesture deliberate. A sign appeared on the infirmary wall one morning, scrawled in chalk by an American orderly. "Healing has no uniform." No one admitted to writing it, but no one erased it either. As August approached, news of Japan's surrender began to trickle through the radios. The war that had drawn every breath of Sato's life was ending. But inside the camp, another kind of history was already being written. One that would outlast both barbed wire and treaties. And in the stillness of the infirmary, beneath the steady hum of the lanterns, Dr. Kenji Sato closed Gray's Anatomy, folded his hands, and whispered a single word, one he had learned from his patients: peace. The radio crackled with static that August morning, long before the camp bugle. Outside, mist clung to the wire fences, turning the landscape silver. A guard switched stations until a familiar voice, President Truman's, filled the room. His words solemn, final. Japan had surrendered. Inside Camp Livingston's infirmary, Dr. Kenji Sato listened without expression. He simply folded the gauze in his hands and placed it neatly back in the tin tray. The war that had defined every breath of his adult life was over. But here, in this patch of Texas scrub, his duty was not. Captain Pierce watched him from the doorway. "You understand what that means, Sato?" "Yes, sir," Sato said quietly. It means the dying will stop. We should be ready for the sick to live longer, Pierce blinked. You sound almost relieved. I am, Sato replied. Even prisoners must breathe when war ends. The captain didn't know what to make of that. He just nodded toward the tents outside. The Red Cross is coming next week. They'll want to evaluate every POW, see who's fit to return home. Sato's eyes lowered. And you, Captain? You will decide who is fit to remain? Pierce hesitated, then walked away without answering. That afternoon, the camp filled with a restless energy. The guards laughed louder, the prisoners worked slower, and every man looked at the horizon as though a ship might appear to take him home. But not Sato. He stayed at the infirmary, organizing medical files, teaching the nurses how to keep a wound sterile without wasting supplies. Nurse Ellen McCarthy, barely 22, with freckles like spilled salt, had been the first to trust him. She shadowed his every move now, jotting notes in the margins of her field journal. You don't use iodine on everything, she said one morning. That's new, Sato smiled. Sometimes it burns healthy skin. The body fights best when we help it, not punish it. Ellen laughed. Sounds like something my pastor would say. He looked at her, puzzled. Is he a doctor? No, she said, smiling. A preacher. Ah, Sato nodded. Then perhaps he knows more of healing than I do. That same week, Sergeant Monroe returned to full duty. His limp was slight, his gratitude heavier than he liked to admit. When he saw Sato in the yard, he called out, Doc! You still patching people up, even after peace broke out? Sato turned, shading his eyes. Peace still has many patients, Monroe chuckled. You got that right. Some of the boys can't sleep. Say they still hear engines at night. Sato's expression softened. Then we will teach them to listen for quieter sounds. He began holding short, evening rounds after dinner. No rank, no sides. Guards and prisoners both came to the infirmary to learn small remedies. How to set a sprained ankle. How to clean wounds without fear. How to breathe through pain instead of fighting it. At first, Captain Pierce thought it was absurd, but when he saw half his men sleeping better and fewer accidents reported, he stopped objecting. The Red Cross inspection arrived on schedule, a tall Swiss delegate with rimless glasses in the habit of noting everything. He walked through the camp with Pierce and an interpreter, stopping finally at the infirmary. This prisoner, Sato, the inspector asked, flipping through a file. He is your chief medic? Pierce cleared his throat, unofficially. He's been helping, the inspector raised an eyebrow. A Japanese officer treating Americans? That is unusual. Pierce gestured toward Monroe, who stood beside the tent flap. Ask him if it works, Monroe grinned. Saved my leg, saved Alan's life, and probably saved this camp from falling apart. You want unusual? Try going back to how it was before him. The inspector wrote something in his notebook, then approached Sato. Doctor, when you return home, what will you do? Sato looked up, his hand still gloved. I will plant trees, he said. In Japan, hospitals grow where there is shade. The inspector nodded slowly. A noble answer. But until you return, you should keep healing here. That single sentence, recorded in the Red Cross log, changed everything. From that day on, Dr. Kenji Sato was listed officially as a camp medical technician, non-combatant. It was more than permission. It was respect. Weeks passed. The infirmary became the quiet heart of the camp. Evenings smelled of soap and rain. Ellen McCarthy learned to suture, Monroe handled triage, and Captain Pierce, though still a man of rules, began sitting on the porch steps after rounds, listening to Sato speak about medicine like it was scripture. In my country, Sato said one night, we say a doctor's work is to return a man's purpose, not his pulse. Pierce frowned. Explain. When the pulse returns but the spirit does not, we have failed, Sato said. War taught us to measure life only by breathing. Peace must teach us to measure it by meaning. The captain stared into the lantern light. Maybe that's the part they didn't cover in army training. Then perhaps, Sato said softly, we can start a new training here. By September, the heat broke. The pecan trees turned brown at the edges, and rumors spread that the camp would close by Christmas. Repatriation orders were posted on the bulletin board, names printed in tight columns. One morning, Monroe walked into the infirmary with a folded list. They're shipping out the first batch next week. You're on it, Doc. Sato looked up, expression unreadable. So soon? Yeah. Orders from Washington. They want everyone back on home soil before winter. Ellen stopped wrapping a bandage. But who's going to run the infirmary? Monroe shrugged. We'll manage. That night, Sato stayed late, cleaning the lantern chimneys until the glass gleamed. He paused at the cot where Monroe had once lain feverish. His hands rested on the metal frame, and for a moment, He whispered something in Japanese, a prayer perhaps, or a farewell. 2 days later, a convoy of trucks rolled into camp to transport the first group of prisoners. But as Sato stepped outside with his small canvas bag, Captain Pierce intercepted him. "You're not going," Pierce said. Sato blinked. "Sir?" "The War Department sent new orders. They're keeping you stateside. Temporary assignment to train Army medics on infection control." Sato stared at him, struggling for words. "They will let me teach?" Pierce nodded. "Under supervision, but yes, they're calling it the Sato method." For the first time since anyone had known him, the Japanese doctor's composure cracked. His eyes shone and his voice faltered. "That is not my name alone, Captain. It belongs to all who chose not to hate." Pierce extended his hand. It hung awkwardly for a moment before Sato grasped it firmly. "I don't know about history," Pierce said, "but this camp's never going to forget you." In the weeks that followed, the infirmary became a classroom. Wooden benches replaced cots. Sato demonstrated new sterilization techniques using cactus ash and boiled water. Monroe and Ellen translated every step for visiting medics from nearby posts. They filled notebooks, asked questions, and listened like students before a master. On the wall, the chalked words remained. "Healing has no uniform. No one erased them." On the final day before his reassignment, Sato gathered his few belongings, a folded uniform, a letter from his wife in Nagano, and the well-worn copy of Gray's Anatomy Monroe had given him. Ellen found him at the doorway. "You'll write us, won't you?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Perhaps. Or perhaps you will see my lessons in your patients." "That would be enough," she nodded, eyes bright. "You taught me more than any textbook." He paused, looking around the small tent that had held so much pain and healing. "Then this place has already done its work." As he stepped into the sunlight, the wind lifted the edges of his papers. One page caught on the nail of the door frame, a handwritten chart titled Principles of Camp Medicine, 1945. At the bottom, in careful script, Sato had written, "We learned to heal our enemies, and in doing so, found our humanity." Winter came softly to Texas that year, a kind of peace disguised as wind. The last POWs had been shipped home, the watchtowers dismantled, the gates chained open. What had once been Camp Livingston was now just a scatter of concrete foundations and an empty flagpole that clanked in the cold. But one building still stood, the infirmary. Inside, it smelled of dust and sun-baked paper. Dr. Kenji Sato walked its length alone for the last time. His U.S. Army transport was due at dawn, bound for Fort Sam Houston, where he would train medical officers before his eventual repatriation to Japan. He paused by the cot that had once held Sergeant Monroe, tracing a fingertip along the frame's rust. Beside it lay a folded American flag and a small envelope marked in Ellen McCarthy's careful handwriting. "For Dr. Sato." He opened it. Inside was a photograph. The entire infirmary staff lined up in the yard, uniforms half-buttoned, dust swirling around their boots. Someone had written on the back, "For the man who changed how we heal." For a long time he said nothing. Then he tucked the photo into his breast pocket, bowed once toward the empty ward, and stepped outside. At Fort Sam Houston, the lectures were brief and quiet. American officers came expecting to correct a foreigner and left with notebooks full of sketches. Sato demonstrated how to build sterile basins from oil drums, how to make charcoal filters from burned pecan shells, how to treat heat stroke with diluted saline instead of ice water. But his lessons were never just about the body. Medicine, he told them, is not war in another uniform. It is surrender. Every patient you treat wins and you lose, but it is a beautiful loss. The room always went still when he spoke like that. Some students shifted in their seats, uncomfortable. Others wrote the words down exactly. One officer asked, "Doctor, where did you learn all this?" Sato hesitated. "In a place where I was not meant to teach," but they listened anyway. Afterward, Captain Pierce visited him from Camp Livingston, now reassigned to Fort Worth. He entered the lecture hall halfway through a class and stood quietly in the back until it ended. When the students filed out, Sato looked up and smiled. "You came far, Captain," Pierce grinned. "Not as far as you." He held out a small box wrapped in brown paper. "The War Department cleared it. Thought you'd like to see it before you go home." Sato opened it slowly. Inside lay a simple brass plaque. Camp Livingston Infirmary. In honor of Dr. Kenji Sato, 1945. Healing has no uniform. Sato's throat tightened. "They will forget my name soon enough," he said softly. "But perhaps they will remember those words." Pierce shook his head. "Not a chance." Spring, 1946. The transport ship USS St. Albans departed Galveston carrying the last group of repatriated Japanese nationals. Sato stood on deck, the Texas shoreline fading behind him. He still wore the khaki uniform, sleeves rolled, rank patch removed, the pocket heavy with the photograph from Ellen. The sea wind was cool. He closed his eyes and let it sting. Around him men wept, prayed, or stared into nothing. Sato simply whispered the same word he'd said the day the war ended. Peace. When the ship reached Yokohama, he found his country scarred but breathing. Hospitals stood without roofs, medicine cupboards empty. He went straight to work. Within months, he had established a small clinic in Nagano, a one-room building made from salvaged lumber and tin. Above the doorway hung a handmade sign in English and Japanese, The Clinic of Mercy, Est. 1946. The first patients were children suffering from malnutrition. Then came mothers, then old soldiers. He treated them all, sometimes with medicine, sometimes only with words. One evening, as he locked the clinic door, a bicycle messenger approached. "Letter from America," the man said, bowing. Sato thanked him and carried it inside. The envelope bore a Texas postmark. The handwriting was careful, feminine. Ellen's. He unfolded the pages. Dear Dr. Sato, Camp Livingston no longer exists. They tore it down last month. But before they did, we saved one thing, your chalkboard. It still said, "Healing has no uniform." We kept it in the new medical school wing at Fort Sam Houston. They call it the Sato ward now. Captain Pierce says you'd probably tell us not to, but we did it anyway. Monroe's leg healed fine. He's farming in Oklahoma, says the soil reminds him of those cactus lessons. As for me, I'm teaching new nurses what you taught us, that hands can't hate while they heal. If you ever come back to Texas, you'll find a home here. Your student, Ellen McCarthy. Sato read it twice. The lamp hissed softly beside him. Outside, children laughed in the distance. He folded the letter carefully and set it beside his stethoscope. Years passed. The clinic grew. Students came from across Japan to study what they called the Texas method, unaware that it had once been born behind barbed wire. In 1947, an American delegation visited as part of a medical exchange program. Among them was a familiar face, Captain Harold Pierce, now retired, his uniform replaced by a linen suit. When he stepped into the clinic, Sato rose to greet him. They bowed, then shook hands. Pierce looked around the humble room, the bamboo beds, the filtered water drums, the clean smell that lingered despite the heat. "So this is where you ended up." "This is where I began," Sato said. Pierce smiled. "You know, they still tell your story back home. The cadets at Sam Houston study your notes," Sato chuckled. "Then perhaps they will improve upon them." They stood for a moment in silence. Two men who had once been enemies and were now something else entirely. Pierce reached into his coat and produced a photograph. The same infirmary picture Ellen had given Sato, but enlarged and framed. Beneath it, in gold letters, was a new inscription. "In memory of a man who taught us that mercy is stronger than victory." Sato's eyes glistened. "You have come far, Captain." "So have you, Doctor," Pierce said. "So have we all." That evening, after Pierce departed, Sato stepped outside. The fields around the clinic glowed with the faint green of new rice. The mountains beyond Nagano caught the last pink light of the setting sun. He stood for a long time, listening, not to the echoes of war anymore, but to the steady rhythm of a world learning how to breathe again. From somewhere far off, a child called out in laughter. It was the same sound he had once heard through the infirmary walls in Texas, the sound that had told him life was returning. He smiled, whispering words in both languages. Peace, always peace. And as dusk settled, the wind carried with it the faintest echo of that chalked phrase, the one that had outlived the camp, the fences, even the war itself.